Welcome, everyone. I'm going to get started on some housekeeping as everyone joins in. Welcome to Breaking Down Data Silos for Inclusive AI. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here today. My name is Julie Nichols, and I am the Engagement Officer for the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. I encourage you all to introduce yourself as well in your area of work in the document we're going to be pasting in the chat. You're more than welcome as well to include any questions or comments there as well today. There's going to be a Q&A feature on the Zoom that you can also be using if you wish to do so. Today is the second webinar in the Global Partnerships AI for Inclusive Development series. This past summer, alongside Development Gateway, we hosted an AI dialogue series discussing opportunities and challenges of implementing AI tools. And last week, we hosted our first webinar titled Where Demand Meets Supply, Ethical and Fit for Purpose Examples of AI in Development. If you attended those events, thank you and welcome back. And if you're new to the series, we are excited that you're here. These dialogues have informed the agenda today, and that we have asked some AI and data practitioners to discuss challenges in data systems for AI models. There will be different focused discussions today. After each, you'll have the opportunity to input thoughts and comments at the end of the presentation. Your inputs are critical to informing our future actions in this area, so we greatly appreciate your participation during the webinar. I'm now excited to introduce our moderator, Jenna from the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, Senior Director of Policy. Over to you, Jenna.
Thanks very much, Julia. It's really lovely to be here today. It's a great pleasure for me to moderate our discussion on breaking down data silos for inclusive AI. So as we all know, there's a lot of hype around artificial intelligence, and it's for good reason, right? AI and other emerging technologies are changing our lives at an incredibly fast pace, and they're also changing the face of development. So as we say, the future is definitely here. But in the midst of this hype, I think we all recognize and see that the data piece can get lost. But this community in the global partnership and more broadly in the data for development sector knows how foundational data is to AI models and tools. And because the data is so essential, we know that it needs to be high quality. We know that it needs to be appropriate and representatives. And we know all too well that there are really big risks if it isn't, especially in development applications. We also know that a lot of the kinds of data that's needed to train AI tools is not accessible to AI developers in the public sector, in the private sector, or otherwise. So rather than wringing our hands about bad data or inaccessible data or unrepresentative data and the resulting sort of suboptimal development of AI tools and solutions in development, we want to try to move the conversation on. We want to better understand what are the key barriers to data access for AI in development, including the ways in which governance frameworks that enable data sharing can help with the development of useful, appropriate, and safe AI tools. So more specifically, our discussion today will help us unpack what data is useful for creating AI models to address development challenges and how, who is holding this data and to what extent is it accessible for this purpose. We hope to be able to share common challenges and also solicit examples and input on approaches for improving how data is accessed and sourced and shared for AI in development. As Julia said, this webinar is part of a longer series. If you've been here for some of the other discussions, welcome back. And if not, we're very happy to have you here today and have you join us. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing from our speakers. With us today, we have Fola Adeleke, pardon me for not pronouncing that correctly, Executive Director of the Global Center on AI Governance. I'll just name all of our speakers quickly. We also have Kenneth Mubea, the Capacity Development Lead from Digital Earth Africa. We have Thomas Carey Wilson, a researcher at the Open Data Institute. And we have Luis Gonzalez Morales, the Chief of Web Development and Data Visualization Unit at UN Statistics Division. So, first, we're going to hear a short presentation of about 5 minutes from each speaker, providing their perspective on the questions I highlighted. And then we'll have some follow up questions with them. And as we go, we're going to launch a Slido poll for you to provide input and weigh in. We will also share the results over the course of the webinar. And you're also very welcome, as Julia said earlier, to use that Google Doc for questions or the Q&A function in the Zoom. So without further ado, I'd like to turn over to Fola to share his perspective with us.
Thank you very much, Jenna, and hello, everyone. Welcome to this important conversation, and thank you to the hosts for inviting me. I want to speak about governments as a provider of data for AI. And I want to do so essentially from an African perspective, where we have a huge challenge with the availability of data. Governments are important collectors and producers of data. Governments hold data that is nationally or subnationally representative. They hold data that provides insight into important social issues, right, such as school attendance, social protection, the functioning of healthcare systems, and many more. And government data is often generated through their own provision of government services to the public. And this kind of data can be an important foundation for developing AI tools that address social challenges and developmental priorities, including efficiency issues within government service provisions, gaps in access to education, healthcare, sanitation, and the like. And we are seeing local AI startups across Africa utilizing some of this government data to tackle some of these unique challenges. We've got a startup in South Africa called Think, which is using generative AI, for example, to analyze and interpret routine TB program data for evidence-based decision making. We have another think tank in Nigeria that is utilizing, primary health information of children to be able to provide vaccine information to members of the public. In Rwanda, they're accessing medical records to be able to provide virtual assistant services for diagnosis and treatments for healthcare workers. So we are seeing innovative use of governmental data by the private sector. But the provision of government data to AI developers must be undertaken responsibly, considering various foundational principles in respect of human rights, in respect of privacy, consent, inclusivity, and ethical use. And this requires several measures that may be adapted in relation to different country contexts and needs. Such measures include mechanisms to ensure that sensitive data is legally and safely shared, adherence to data standards that support interoperability, ensuring data is shared in a format that is structured, discoverable, reusable, machine readable. And to be able to ensure this kind of responsible sharing of data, there are different models that have emerged. And these different models that have emerged was the subject of a report I led in drafting on behalf of the Global Partnership on AI last year. And in that report, we looked at case studies from across the globe. We define the provision of governmental data for AI as referring to the ways in which governments share data they hold and develop with third-party AI developers, whether these are for-profit companies or non-profit organizations. And governments may share this data openly through different platforms. And the first option, the first model in governments providing data for inclusive AI is the one that is very well known, open data, right? Open data has been around for a while, but there are concerns around the effectiveness of open data in the modern AI economy. Calls for open data access sometimes risk opening up opportunities for existing commercial interests to appropriate and exploit data assets. We know that, and it also raises privacy and data sovereignty concerns sometimes. So as part of strengthening the well-known model of open data, there have been calls around, for example, thinking about data justice and data solidarity. And the objective of data solidarity is strengthening collective control and ownership of data. And it will usually feature three pillars, focusing on facilitating good data use, preventing and mitigating harm, and return profit to the public domain. And in this model, governments can serve as independent trustees to ensure compliance with pillars of this model. And then a second model for data sharing for governmental data is data stewardship. It's emerged as a responsible rights preserving, participatory concept of data intermediaries with the goal of providing agency, transparency, and protection of data to data subjects, and negotiating with data requesters and seeking ways in which data can be of benefit to the society. So within this data stewardship model, we essentially have two vehicles: data trust and data institutions. Data trusts are a form of data stewardship that supports data producers to pool their data with the aim of collectively negotiating terms of use with potential data users through the oversight of independent trustees. And then you've got data institutions, which are organizations that steward data use towards public interest use. So governments can act as data institutions and steward data in various ways, including protecting sensitive data along those lines. And then, of course, you have public-private partnerships. Public-private partnerships is emerging as an effective model. The OECD cited the example of the Norwegian Tax Authority and its partnership with the financial sector to implement automatic exchange of loan application data. And in one of the case studies that we looked at in the UK, we also saw a public partnership model emerging where government selects, a private sector AI developer to receive some of its data to develop a particular AI-based technology. And then over and beyond public-private partnerships, you also have contracts where governments often offer their data for free and have contractual arrangements with third parties and prescribe, a scope of obligations to these third parties when they are accessing government data. So these four models, we picked up that they have been applied in different forms in four case studies we looked at. The first one was in the United Kingdom, where, and a lot of you might be familiar with this case study, where the National Health Services in the UK entered into essentially a contractual partnership between the UK's NHS and Google's AI DeepMind to share data to develop a particular solution in dealing with kidney diagnosis. And then in Taiwan, there was another situation where the government of Taiwan, essentially served as a data institution and brokered access to data by private sector developers with members of the public. So the government was serving as an institution that verified and conducted due diligence on AI companies and created a platform that allowed members of the public to opt into providing their data directly to private AI developers. In Nigeria, there's the Social Protection Program, which created a number of challenges which I can speak to later on, where the government selected a private sector provider to try and expand the social protection program. And then in Colombia as well, you had the Data Commons Initiative to build AI tools to provide farmers with actionable information. I am going to stop there for now because my time is up, but I look forward to discussing some of these challenges that arises with these data sharing models later on in the conversation. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Fola. That was really helpful and sort of systematic review of the different approaches and models for data sharing. I'm excited because I think that a number of our other panelists have some experience with them as well. So that'll be super interesting and very much looking forward to come on to that discussion of the barriers. So now we'll move over to Kenneth Mubea, who, as I said, is the Capacity Development Lead at Digital Earth Africa. Over to you, Ken.
Thank you so much, Anna. From Digital South Africa side, being born also from the global partnership is that of combining different data sets to support the decision-making perspective in the continent, and the platform is built on the partnerships. So combining different data sets has been quite a process for actually making sure that we provide what is timely for other perspectives. And most of our champions have been persons from government, key to use the data for decision making. So we are looking at also the UN statistics where governments are supposed to report on certain indicators. So when you pay a visit to statistics, you'll see what is required, but AI is what will make sure they're able to produce something on a country level or use by use case. So some of the tools also borrowed from other partners like FAOs are trying to support also on agricultural statistics. Some of these are still in champion pilot as well, because then you need a lot of drivers in the same. So we are looking at the ecosystem from governments to academia, as well as the champions in the middle. So close support to the various sectors. We've seen the early champions, like early career persons, like the Global Partnership Program on the Capacity Accelerator. These are the key persons that are really using AI, or actually now looking for data sources and platforms such as Digital South Africa and others, and also looking at interoperability of our platforms and other platforms. So it's not about, it's actually breaking the silos, going beyond the comfort zone of different programs. Closely working also in the private sector partners like Esri, seeing how tools can move from this sector to another sector. Even now, recently seeing an example of supporting flood case. We had conversations where we can use some tools from Esri. They can use our data sets on their platform, Africa Job Portal, and then also we can see how they can leverage other technologies and skills from persons through hackathons or other programs. So there's a lot of demand. Also, I remember earlier conversations in the Open Data Institute where they were working on a pilot program somewhere supporting on forest ecosystem, and then this evolved to carbon monitoring as well, which is very key. Then also looking at the champions, different countries, even countries having special envoys. So we saw an opportunity also to support one of these countries, something on their water towers, as well as carbon monitoring as well. And since this is on a high level basis, we can even see programs and like the Data Fest, where we actually connect different countries. Our UN countries or other countries are learning from other UN statistics. For example, recently working with Tunisia, saying their priorities and how they can even monitor their sea level rises. So because we already have a service that we built based on data sets from the US Geological Survey, so a system which goes over 35 years, but then with the local market and entrepreneurs is to see how we can engage them and how they can even help with the big data sources that we have in terms of validation and credibility of the reports. And maybe the conversation going around AI is that of the local knowledge, because just engagements with different countries, persons were asking, really, what happened actually years before our technology, for example, in the 50s? Could the replication of some of the events, like we've had extreme events in East Africa, some floods, and even having a conversation with someone informally, there's no documentation of what really happened, but you walk somewhere, talk to someone who's almost 90 years, they'll tell you this event actually occurred at this time. It was actually 1961 that we had similar floods in East Africa. And then a lot of people lost a lot of livelihoods. So if our models are better trained, we could see how we could save some livelihoods, because some people are forced to change from careers or even rendered without livelihoods. So it's quite concern also for governments to be more prepared, agile as well, and also looking at how these AI tools could also help in the disaster risk resilience, because we are seeing extreme events like now in southern countries in Africa, like in Zambia, already having a lot of droughts to the level that there's power blackouts for 5 days is quite not good for governments as well. But on the other extreme in Senegal and other countries, they're having extreme floods, and governments have to spend quite some resource to fit in with this context. So if all sectors are really engaged, there's value addition on the AI as well as the earlier careers as well, the capacities programs coming together as this one, such a convening as well, and also looking at more convenings to support the government so that we work together as a partnership and borrowing from the log of GPSTD to provide the better data to save lives and prosperous tomorrow. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken, very much. It's very interesting to hear a little bit about your experience and thinking about combining data sources, and maybe we can dig even more into that in a little bit. So now we'll move on to hear from Thomas Carey Wilson, who's a researcher at the Open Data Institute. Over to you, Thomas.
Great. Thank you very much, Jenna, and thank you for the whole GPSDD team for having me. I think today I just wanted to use this as an opportunity to kind of go over a few general challenges that we've observed across our work. So of course and that work specifically being the work within our data-centric AI program, which I'll go over describing in just a moment. So we do recognize that kind of AI technologies have the potential to develop to address global sustainable development challenges. We're aware of some really interesting use cases in that space. I think one of which comes up quite a lot is kind of using satellite data to monitor deforestation rates in the Amazon rainforest. Kind of, using AI to do that kind of efficiently. And we're also aware that kind of sustainable development NGOs are also using AI tools to make fundraising efforts a bit more kind of efficient. But as everyone here is aware, as mentioned in the intro, data is foundational to building AI systems that tackle these issues effectively. I think historically there has been quite a significant focus on building kind of more elaborate models, whereas kind of studies have shown over the last few years that actually ensuring that higher quality data is used to train simpler AI models can actually yield better results than building more complex models. So in our data-centric AI program, we try to look at kind of data governance, data practice, and data transparency issues that we need to tackle to make sure people are more aware of how foundational data is to building better AI systems. But there are several kind of challenges to this. So the first one really is the risk of data fragmentation and accessibility to that data. So our co-founder, Sir Nigel Shadbolt, wrote an article over the last few months talking about the risk, not the certainty of model collapse. So this is essentially the observation that if kind of AI generated data is used to train AI models again and again, eventually the outputs of those models will become less and less coherent. So the worry is that as more and more AI generated content is online, the more and more that content will be used to train AI models. And then at a certain point, the outputs of large language models, for instance, will stop making sense, stop functioning. So in this sense, it's not just data per se that is foundational to AI, but human generated data is necessary for AI. However, this data is scattered across multiple different kind of stakeholders, making access quite difficult from governments, NGOs to corporations. And also data availability is quite inequitable. So I think the OECD Digital Economy Outlook report identified recently that more than half of open source AI training data sets are in English, which means that a lot more work needs to be done to factor in data sets that are reflective of other kind of languages. Now, what are kind of the solutions to these problems? Well, in a lot of our work, we've seen that governments across the world have started investing in kind of collaborative data sharing platforms. So we saw in a project in Mexico recently that they were investing in efforts to create a data sharing platform for their regulators to share data with them for kind of compliance reasons. But making data between other sectors available is also quite important. And I think an interesting example there is really this concept of data spaces that the EU has been talking about quite a lot recently, where organizations within a specific sectoral ecosystem can securely share and exchange data to generate insights and services that they couldn't achieve individually. Now, that is mainly a concept at the moment. There's a concept for health data spaces, agricultural data spaces, but there's this entity called Gaia-X, which is trying to facilitate the creation of these data spaces by providing a framework and infrastructure for that data sharing to occur in a safe way. But these questions about exactly how to facilitate that sharing in a way that's respectful of potentially sensitive commercial data is really the crux of the issue. And now coming on to the issue of English language data sets. So there are several efforts ongoing. There's the Bhinneka corpus, which is a multilingual corpus for 5 Indonesian local languages, which is currently being developed. And the Lacuna Fund is currently awarding grants to teams for the creation and expansion of machine learning data sets for low-resourced African languages. But ultimately, these efforts do need to be ramped up. I do have a few more points, but I think we can maybe come on to those during the Q&A. So I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Thomas. And thanks to everyone for being mindful of time. It helps us to move on and to hear different perspectives. But that was really valuable in thinking about making that point about human generated data and thinking about the fragmented landscape and the different mechanisms for bringing different players together. What's interesting, I think, is how to think about getting data that's locked away by private sector entities or is held by civil society or even the local knowledge that Ken was talking about, and the government data that Folo was talking about. So they all have different sort of features and challenges. And in an ideal world, it might be the combination of all of them and figuring out how to make that happen. So we have a Slido. Please take a look at it. Please scan the QR, go to the Slido, share with us your thoughts, and we'll look at the results a little bit later. And now we're going to come on to hear from Luis Gonzalez Morales from the UN Statistics Division. Luis, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jenna, and thank you to GPSDD for this invitation. And this is really a very interesting discussion. I hope I can provide a few share some insights from our experience working on the UN Data and the UN Data Commons initiative. Now, this is an initiative that essentially aims to provide the basic open data infrastructure that could be part of this challenge that you have raised. So the foundational quality data infrastructure that can then enable data applications of AI for sustainable development. So I think we all agree that to have effective and useful applications of these amazing technologies, we have to have proper infrastructure, proper standards. No? So this Data Commons initiative, its main objective is to make this data, which is highly curated, high quality data generated across the UN system, to make this data AI ready. So to enable the discovery and the assessment and the access of this data set by now automated agents, not only human agents, to harmonize these concepts that are used across different domains and across different organizations to give the proper tools for the integration of this data in a way that makes sense, and enriching it with context, with provenance, traceability, all of that being not only machine readable, but more importantly, machine actionable, so that algorithms can act on that. So how do we do that? So in my next slide, I want to talk about the approach that we are following, which is creating a knowledge graph. So we are working towards creating, I don't know if you could move the slide for the next. Yeah, so we're building a knowledge graph, which is about organizing this data in a new, relatively new way of looking at it, making these data structures extensible, machine actionable, as I was saying, embedding in the data itself richer semantics, formal logic that allows AI agents then to reason over there and to make inferences and derive insights on it. So by establishing also the explicit links to other data sets and making the data more interconnected, more findable, more searchable. And finally, adding over time new data types, new use cases, new information. So this system is this infrastructure is an infrastructure that needs to continue evolving over time. So in the next slide, please. So why are we so keen of building this basic infrastructure and knowledge graph using knowledge graph technologies? First, to allow to interoperate across domains, to allow to interoperate across organizations using common vocabularies, just leveraging all these linked open data technologies that we have available. But in the context of the new AI applications, by embedding high quality, highly curated data in these structures, it is possible to help these LLMs and algorithmic agents to aggregate the data sets in ways that actually make sense, in ways that are validated by the knowledge of human domain experts. By doing that, also we enable then these applications to establish different links across the semantics of the domains to provide natural language search functionality, but grounding the results of whatever is derived from the LLMs into into facts. So insights that are really reflecting the domain expertise that has been curated and added to the knowledge graphs. So this is essentially what we have. I would like to invite to use this UN Data Commons for the SDGs. If you will that, you will be able to see the applications that we have made of it in the front end. But behind the scenes, there is a data infrastructure, open data infrastructure that can be leveraged by any kind of third-party application. So that's our hope, that we link into that we enable other players in the data ecosystem to link the official statistical data provided by the UN system to other data sets, and at the same time keeping the assurance of the factuality of what is coming out of these AI applications. So happy to continue the discussion, and thank you again for the invitation.
Thanks, Luis. It's really exciting to hear about the UN Data Commons because that provides a sort of public international source of data. So it's a nice complement to what Fola was talking about in terms of the extent to which governments are making data open and accessible and usable. And a challenge, right? A challenge to get the interoperability you need, et cetera. So really exciting development. Before I come back to our panelists with some questions, I think we're gonna post the Slido results. Are we ready to do that, or is that gonna take a second?
We are ready to do that, but it is going to take about 3 seconds.
Okay, so while those Slido results are coming up, just for our panelists, I'm going to come back first to Fola and Thomas to talk a little bit about the barriers you've seen to accessing the different types of data and bringing them together in a way that's meaningful for AI tool development or model development. So let's look at the results here, asking about the challenges and barriers to accessing existing data sets. I see some folks are highlighting representation and relevance, standardization and silos. There are certainly some sectors are more sensitive than others, and the challenges of interoperability, but also maintaining quality is critical. High cost of collection and storing data contributes to agencies making data only available at a price that might not be affordable to all. I think that's a useful point and interesting to think about the ways in which open data and open data sort of infrastructures and mechanisms like the UN Data Commons can work, but then also understanding that there are other sources of data that can't be made fully open, and what are the other kinds of mechanisms like the concept of the data spaces or data trusts and stewardship. There's a lot of concern about representation and inclusiveness in data, accessibility, quality, so standards and interoperability. So we're seeing a lot of echoing of what our speakers were saying, as well as the need for investment in solid data sets. And this is, I think, an interesting point to land on, because if you recall, around 2015, 2016, when all countries and globally we were grappling with the Sustainable Development Goals and the global partnership was being set up, we were really focused and continue to be really focused on the strength and capacity of national data systems and the capacity of the broader data ecosystem to be producing high quality, reliable, timely data. And so those, what we might call more traditional efforts to strengthen the data system, not only are they still relevant, they're perhaps even more important now because we have even more powerful and more sophisticated tools to be hoovering up and using that data. And it becomes incredibly, incredibly important that the capacity and the quality is there in terms of data produced in the public sector, but also in the private and civil society sectors. So now, thank you very much, everyone, for your input. That's really valuable. We're going to come back. I'll turn to Fola first and then Thomas to hear a little bit about barriers.
Thank you. So from an emerging economy perspective, I think that there are some fundamental hurdles that need to be crossed before we start talking about, breaking data silos for inclusive AI. It's something as basic as, infrastructure development, for example. The AU released a data policy framework in 2022. And that framework highlights data infrastructure that enables an integrated data system as a key strategic asset for African countries. But the scale, extent, and speed of change brought about by data-driven digital technologies make, the regulation of data and the resources needed for that quite intense. So when we talk about data storage and data management infrastructure, which is non-existent or very expensive on the continent, it creates a significant barrier. So for example, the warehousing needs of either structured data, semi-structured, or unstructured data are different. And technical choices around this must center data needs, and specifically in this in an African context, the ultimate accessibility needs. So while some features of public sector data can be described as silos, like we're doing today, we also have to talk about the issue of velocity, which refers to the speed data that is generated, delivered, and processed, and the kind of technical infrastructure that will support that. But you also have to talk about other basic things around digitizing paper records that governments are collecting, and that process of digitization, from paper to electronic is also a very expensive process that often isn't a funding priority for African governments. So that also creates a barrier, and there are also some cultural attitudes that we also need to address. A lot of governments still have that hesitancy in making their own data available to the private sector for the development of, AI-based systems. So tackling that issue of, government secrecy and government sometimes acknowledging that potentially, the end goal is beneficial, but being able to cross that hurdle of making that data, which they deem to be, an official confidential data, available, and educating them that some of this data can be de-identified to address concerns around privacy. You still need to embark on a process of orientation and skills development, capacity strengthening, to be able to get governments to buy into that idea of a true public-private partnership. Thanks.
Thank you. Those are very useful reminders. They're sort of the foundational elements that are holding us back, certainly. Thomas, over to you.
Great, thank you, Jenna. Yeah, I mean, I think when we talk about data governance, it's such a kind of a broad term, and there are so many different pillars that sit underneath it. But I think like a few aspects of data governance that we've seen that aren't quite working for the AI context are first of all kind of licenses. We've seen, I think, a lot of our kind of stakeholders mention how the lack of licenses kind of standardized for different AI use cases, models and potentially data types as well, kind of introduces a kind of barrier for organizations wanting to share data on a large scale for those purposes, which quite often leads to these bespoke license agreements being developed, like the sort of license agreements you see being struck up between OpenAI and Reddit for kind of Reddit's copious amount of text data to feed LLMs. And the problem there is really that there is kind of a real lack of oversight on kind of those license terms, exactly what rights and obligations are associated with those data. And just in general as well, we've noticed that there are a lot of licenses which are not tailored specifically for AI or data being used for AI data sets on repositories like Hugging Face and Kaggle. Licenses like Creative Commons or even licenses for software being used, which really aren't fit for purpose. And a certain a part of why they really aren't fit for purpose is that some of the terms really don't work in the context of AI. One of the major kind of aspects of these licenses is the question of attribution. So input data may have a set of terms around kind of who needs to be attributed for that data. But the question of how that attribution should be reflected in the outputs of the models seems to be kind of a question mark, or whether it should be reflected at all. And what's more as well, there's often these kind of non-commercial limitations on the use of data in certain licenses. And some stakeholders that we've spoken to are quite confused about in what circumstances that non-commercial limitation applies, especially when you get teams of academics or researchers and organizations experimenting with different model types where they're not completely sure whether that model is going to be commercializable down the line. Should you put a non-commercial limitation on the data used for that license? Nobody really seems to know. So I think licensing agreements, getting those kind of AI ready would be a massive help, really.
Thanks. Those are all really useful and very concrete points, which is incredibly helpful. We're going to launch one more Slido poll for everyone's input to reflect a bit on how we overcome some of these challenges. But we're also now going to turn to Ken and Luis on that question about how to overcome some of these challenges. I think, Ken, you've been thinking a lot about bringing different data sources together and building trust in that data use. So over to you, Ken, first, and then Luis.
Thank you so much, Shana. On the diversity of sources is then the other aspect of trust on those diverse data sets as well. So there's a lot of, as well as engagements to get the buy-in for the trust on that data from a different source can actually be used and complementing other sources. So looking at the historical data sets we get from the imagery is quite extensive, over 30 years plus. But then going now to the country level to support like the national adaptation plans, like recently supporting some work, assessments of the water plans or wetlands, is to actually see what sources those governments actually have access. And we've seen some of this actually doesn't exist. So it has to go to global data sets. And then the other point of spatial data infrastructure has been mentioned. So what we are seeing is countries learning from other countries on what is working, and also more additional funding in terms of some work we've seen supporting wetlands, like in Uganda, has been possible through a women organization supporting more specific now diversity and inclusion, to have more people on the ground and people who have some historical information, and also in terms of diversity and inclusion, so that whatever is produced is something which is actually acceptable within the communities, the government. So looking from the small level going upwards, because from our side of satellite imagery is more global to local, but then we cannot match what is trusted on the ground and inclusion purposes. Then also we heard about the diversity of languages in the work we do, mostly diversify in terms of continent English and French. We are seeing also the other element of going further refinements to Arabic and also Portuguese, to include more countries as well. But also in other countries like in East Africa, like some work we did in Zanzibar, is to see how much you can actually even go down to their language like Swahili in East Africa, so that now you can actually get more information on that statistics office. What is really working? What can we provide? And what other sources of data have you collected? Has the communities been included? So that we saw the other part when we want to reach the people on the ground, we had to include teams like youth mapper networks, who are team of people in the universities working closely with the communities, and they're able to share, like in this particular project, working more on resilience and mangroves, mapping the mangroves, borrowed on a project which was already done by World Bank, where they just presented a platform to come up with a special plan. But then these are small islands who are vulnerable to climate change. But then now the young people now on the ground with the lecturers working, communicating, and showing what they get from our satellite imagery. Is this something they accept? Is it something they can communicate to? Is it something that when you say you're actually working together, they have the buy-in? So that helping governments to reach having consensus on the ground as well, because then you start some work, then you realize there are other historical issues in terms of land tenure, which could be beyond our work. But the inclusion of the people and the teams shows that at least there's somewhere where we can start, and there's somewhere where we can actually help our governments and complement our efforts. So there's a lot of quite some barriers. Of course, one of them will be the internet connectivity using some of our platforms, but over time, We are seeing also connections happening in the continent, Starlink maybe, which is beyond this conversation as well. But other opportunities are coming in, mobile providers, and also looking at country level work with the statistics. There's quite some work, like in Ghana, there's a lot of inclusivity in the work they're doing. So more of inclusion gives the buy-in for the diversity of sources of data, as well as training our models, which could be more continental, but now more specifically to local areas, and having the government having a better scorecard everywhere they go in, so that now we are seeing countries having special envoys for AI, one of them being Kenya, because that's quite a champion, and possibly that's why they even hosted the data fest next year. So we are seeing quite something is happening. We just need more champions, more people to come from the stats to actually move around and see what's happening. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Ken. I like that emphasis on engaging with local players and local communities in different ways to kind of fill gaps, or perhaps to fine tune some of the training and some of the models. I think sometimes that we talk a lot about what's the input data, but also I think there's a fine tuning stage when it comes to those models. We have the Slido up just for everyone to keep putting in your responses, please. But I'll turn to Luis now, and you'll be our last from among the speakers. You'll have the last word to share some thoughts on how to overcome some of these barriers we've discussed. Over to you, Luis.
Thank you, Yana. Well, I would like to add now my perspective in terms of the lack of standardization and fragmentation of the data as key challenges. There are still these are still challenges today after 20 years that we've been trying to address them. So I think there is now the understanding that we need some basic data infrastructures in place, infrastructures that are costly to build, costly to maintain, and require proper funding and proper resourcing. So these fundamental digital infrastructure are public goods that require investment and in order to generate economic benefits and social benefits across the board. So technology is not anymore the problem. No, the technology is there. There are tested technologies. There are tested standards. But I think one of the key challenges that we need to tackle is how to make these data infrastructures not only available to specific communities, but interconnected across different domains, across different stakeholders. So there will always be multiple data infrastructures that are needed by different stakeholder groups, by different communities, and the challenge is to interconnect these data infrastructures. So, for instance, in the statistical community, when we talk about standardization, we've been working for a very long time in standardizing our processes and standardizing how we exchange and share statistical data using particular standards. But these standards, while very, very powerful and very useful for the working of the statistical systems, are not enough. These standards need to be connected to other standards, like from SGMX to schema.org to DCAT to DDI, many different cross-domain integration frameworks that are already there. So my message is essentially we need to start looking beyond our domain, beyond our community, in order to interconnect. And in order to do that, we also need to have proper funding. So this example I was showing about data commons, I think it's a very exciting project. But it would have not been possible without a very important public-private partnership that provided very significant funding for that. So I think we are deceiving ourselves when we think that we can do things without funding because there is open source, because there are freely available resources. Those solutions, while good for a proof of concept, are not enough for sustainability. So we really need to think of the hard money that is needed to create these infrastructures. Thank you.
Thanks, Luis. Those were some great points. Let's just quickly show the Slido to give all of our listeners and participants the last word. We have examples of different platforms that are doing valuable, I think, data labeling. Bigger private sector companies releasing large-scale open data sets for public use. I like that point, just dialogue. I mean, I think, Luis, you were just making the point about getting out of domains. We've been talking about different methods or models for data sharing. It really relies at the end of the day on the people, not the machines, getting together and figuring out how to do it. Institutional arrangements that promote open access. And implementing some of those proposed steps, and incentivizing the sharing of data sets by offering monetary rewards or providing computational resources. I see a note about Kaggle competitions there too. So some really useful, I think, and valuable insights on steps that can be taken. So, in summary, I want to first off thank our great speakers. You've provided a lot of depth to this question, and I think that that's where we need to go now broadly in the ecosystem. I think when certainly let's just acknowledge that many partners, player in the data for development ecosystem were working with AI before ChatGPT came onto the scene, but certainly with that explosion in large language models, it came into the public consciousness, and that means into policymaker and politician consciousness in a much more real way. And we're confronted much more quickly with the kinds of challenges that come up. And underneath that, we have some really fine-grained and really important issues and steps that need to be taken. Fola really helpfully highlighted some of the basic questions on data infrastructure, digitization, and the basically just like the cultural attitudes toward data sharing and the trust challenges. Ken also spoke about trust and the relationship between getting access to different data sources and building models with sort of engaging at a community level and bringing in additional sources of information or even engagement for fine tuning, I think. We heard some really useful ideas, I think, around models for data sharing, but also some of the challenges with the licenses that we have. I think I think your point, Thomas, on licenses was really well taken. We can't just take the legal mechanisms we have and apply them to this new era. We have to innovate in all kinds of ways. And I think maybe Luis's final points on bringing standards together, bringing people together, getting across domains, and lastly, the investment. So making all this data AI ready, AI actionable, accessible, available, establishing mechanisms for trusted flows of data requires investment. And it requires considerable focus and political prioritization and action as well. So there's a lot to be done. And a lot of opportunities going forward, but also a lot of ideas on the table and a lot of experimentation happening as well in all of the organizations that U4 represent, certainly across the Global Partnership Network and well beyond. We have a last note in the chat that if you'd like to be able to be contacted or to engage with people on this call in the future, do go back to that Google Doc and put your email address in there. And we will be happy to keep you in the loop and to facilitate connections. So with that, we're at time. I want to thank everyone for your contributions, especially our 4 speakers, but everyone who engaged actively in the Google Doc and in the Slido. Thanks for joining us, and have a good rest of your day, afternoon, and evening, wherever you are. Thank you.